I'm the host, Subbu Ramalingam of the Germantown Cricket Podcast. I'll be the first host. We will have rolling hosts. In this podcast, we have Paul. I've known you in the last 4 years. If you could just give an introduction about you, a quick story about you, that'll be fantastic for the audience.
Sure. My name's Paul Hensley. I'm the president of the C.C. Morris Cricket Library Association. We have another person who is the curator, Joe Lynn. Maybe we can get him on another podcast at a later time. He brings a lot of additional perspective on the history of cricket. I got involved in the sport of cricket not as a child. I was recruited by the coach at Haverford my freshman year to come out and try. By my senior year, I ended up being skipper of the team. After college, I ended up going up to New England for a number of years. And when I got back, the people who were running the library said, "We'd really like to have someone young like you join us who's played on the team recently." So I've been involved in being on the board for close to 30 years, and I've been the president for around 20 some years. I was fortunate while I was at the college. I got to go to the opening of the cricket library in 1970. They invited all of the players to come over and meet a bunch of guys who were at the very end of their careers in cricket. But I got to meet John Lester, C.C. Morris, a great bunch of guys who had realized a few years before that they have all this memorabilia, huge amount of scorebooks, pictures, you name it. Somebody was collecting postage stamps about the sport. We have a collection of British cigarette cards showing cricket players. We have a fantastic collection, and they all knew they'd end up in the dumpster unless they found a place to save them. And they all got together, they raised the money to start the library. Everybody put in their collection. Unfortunately, I didn't get to meet Bart King. He was a tremendous collector of trophies. His family donated all of that. I know they reached out to Don Bradman to let him know we were starting a cricket library. He sent a great deal of material over to us, including a signed bat. They rounded up all our friends and said, donate. And it's in our cricket library. It's a fantastic collection.
Excellent. Thank
Uh,
you, Paul. We'll talk about that more. The reason for the podcast is also understand the history of cricket. Cricket was a big game in Philadelphia, in the US back in the 1800s. Is there? How was it? Kind of paint a picture for the audience how it was at that time.
Let me lay out a little bit of a timeline. Prior to the 1860s, cricket bowling was underhand. And they changed the rules so you could have overhand bowling, which made the sport much more exciting. You could do more in terms of swerving the ball than you could underhand. You could bowl much faster. The sport became much more athletic because of that. The kids in Philadelphia got very excited about it. There was a club called Young America, mostly just 11 to 15-year-old boys. Their fathers played cricket, but they decided to play cricket and they stayed with it. The Newhall family had a number of players on the team. One of the very best players ever in the sport, who was American, was Walter Newhall. Unfortunately, he died in the Civil War. He was recruited to take the Young American team up to New York City because he could hit a six. And he was the first American to hit a six. And fans wanted to see how this guy could possibly score 6 runs at one time. It was a fan-driven sport. It had a lot of support from the newspapers. It just grew organically and was very popular. It's an infectious sport once you learn how to play it. It's like you came back to it, it sticks with you. It was much more rigorous as a sport than baseball was at the time, especially in the mid-1800s. Around that time, they had just changed the rules so that you couldn't be caught in the outfield on one bounce. You now needed a mitt to be able to catch the ball. It was more of a child sport. It evolved very rapidly due to Abner Doubleday and the promotion around it, but the sports were very competitive, and it was entrenched very strongly in the Philadelphia area. Some of the things that helped do that, there were early tours where the British came over, Parr's tour in 1859. They had a great time. They loved coming to the US. And they talked up to other players that you could go over and you're going to be entertained. And the Americans really know how to have fun after they finish playing cricket. Probably one of the real turning points was when Dr. Grace came over in 1872. The clubs were established. He just had a fantastic time. He loved everybody at all of the clubs. And he took the publicity back to England, and that started a whole series of more professional tours coming over.
When you say Dr. Grace, you're talking about D.W.G. Grace, the father of cricket.
That's the one and only Dr. Grace. Yes, sir.
That's amazing.
He played at Germantown. He played at Marion. He had a wonderful time. He was very influential. He also entertained American players who came over to England. We have a photo of he standing in the doorway of his house welcoming Bart King. We have a letter on display where he writes to Dr. Lester, who was captain of one of the American teams who was over there, and he says, I need a few good men to play for me on Saturday. They were good enough to play for him. He respected the Americans and he helped build the credibility. And so there was this back and forth where a lot of teams came here. It's like teams from England came, Parr's team in 59. There was a team that came over in 1868, 1872, 1881, 1897, 1909. The Australians
Wow.
came in 78, 93, 96, and 1912. These were test teams, usually from Australia. It turned out you could play a test match series in England, take the boat over in 7 or 8 days, get to the US, tour Philadelphia and New York, go up to Canada and play, take the train across the United States and sail from the West Coast and get home faster than if you took the boat around Cape Horn. And they got paid for doing this. So it was very easy to justify, we're going to make a trip to the US. These were all first-class matches that were played. 102 Americans are considered capped. They played in multi-day, multi-innings matches against first-class teams that traveled here.
Right. First class, meaning that's like professional level cricket. That means these guys were world class at that time, right?
Yes, many of those people could play today. Some of the players were ranked and still ranked. Bart King is still ranked number 2 on the British Summer Cricket League bowling average at 10.01. He held first place for 40 years and somebody beat him by 2/100ths of a run. And speaking of Bart, he was one of the driving forces behind Prince Ranjan Singh coming over here in 1899. He wanted to see America. He was curious of that, but he had lost his wicket a couple years earlier when he was playing for Sussex. Bart took his wicket first ball, and it was the first time, and in fact, the only time in first-class cricket that Prince Ranjan Shinzi lost his wicket first ball. He just wanted to show the Americans that that was a fluke. At the time, there were 4 first-class pitches considered the major clubs. It was Germantown, Marion, Philadelphia, and Belmont. 3 of the 4 still exist today and are playing cricket. Belmont closed around in the early 1900s. It was Bart King's home team, and he ended up transferring and playing later at Philadelphia. Let me just say, in London, there are only 2 first-class pitches. We had 4.
Twice the number of first class pitches and grounds compared to London, which is supposedly the home of
Yes.
cricket.
And one of those is MCC, obviously. It was a very popular sport. There were in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 clubs that were established operating on a regular basis. There were a lot of sort of pickup clubs when the selectors were choosing players from Philadelphia. A lot of those came from the first class clubs. Many times you find players who you only find their names mentioned in the roster of those major matches. They were playing for some of the smaller clubs. If you had talent, they wanted you on the team. This wasn't selected just because you belonged to a club. You had to be good. You were representing Philadelphia in the United States. And at the same time, there were clubs that were just richly endowed with talent, Germantown being one. The Newhall family had 4 generations of players. There was a Newhall on virtually every team that played internationally for this sport.
Some of these players are popular in other countries. Ranji Singh Ji as an example in India. Newhalls, for example, I don't know Newhalls. Personally, never heard of them until I heard from you and a couple of others. So we'll start with the Newhalls.
Very big family. There were 5 brothers basically in the early generation. One was Walter, who unfortunately died. The others were exceptional players. We have a photo on the wall of the 4 brothers. As other generations joined them, there's 3 generations. They could field a competitive team of just Newhalls. They probably could beat just about anybody. They were very skilled. They were in the sugar business. They had a refinery in Philadelphia that the family owned, lived a very good life, liked to entertain, and were very athletic, a gifted family, clearly. They supported Germantown. They were among the founders. I send information over from that scrapbook showing who was essentially managing Germantown at the time. And one of the key people there was one of the Newhall brothers. Just as a quick aside, I've invited a recent generation. He's about my age. One of the Newhalls, he came up to the library and was just blown away with how much information we had. You walk in and you see 3 or 4 pictures of your family, and it's like, wow. And I'm hoping to get more donations from him of materials and photos so we can get more depth around that. Germantown was central to all of these. At the time when the new pavilion was built,
You're talking about the large building that's there right now, where the clubhouse is.
yes, it was considered the best cricket facility in the world. And that's the British saying that. It was better, and in some ways still is better than MCC is in many ways. One of the most favorite spots that all of the other visiting teams wanted to be photographed at was on the porch on the right end as you're looking at the building. Every one of the teams that I mentioned is photographed there. Someone who I've developed a relationship in Australia, who is the grandniece of Joe Darling, who was on the Australian test team that was here touring. It was 1892. The next year he became skipper, and Trumper joined the team. That was one of the greatest teams of all time. She had me send a copy of the photo of Joe sitting on the steps there for the cover of the book. We have Prince Ranjan Singhji there. I can tell you what date they were putting the electric lights in, because we have pictures without the electric lights on either side of the door. And then we have a picture where you can see the fixtures have been installed, but the lights aren't in yet. It was one of the first buildings in Philadelphia to be electrified.
That's amazing. So for the baseball fans, who was the Babe Ruth? I mean, Babe Ruth of cricket at that time.
1870s to 1880s, it was George Patterson, phenomenal batsman. He and Dr. Grace, they were good buddies. George was the best American batsman at the time and a Germantown guy. He also went to Haverford for a couple of years. So we got a little claim on him.
We can share the glory.
There were multiple players who were very good batsmen. It's just you pick the time, you pick the match. Sometimes players just carry the team. You get called in and you're batting 5th or 6th, and it's like, I'm just going to hit away, and they'll score 55 runs. All of the clubs used to have grandstands. I think it was 6,000 to 8,000 people could be seated in the grandstand there. And then photos we have show people circling the field.
What did they play for at that time?
When the big matches were on, it was really Philadelphia against the world. If the Irish showed up, the British showed up, the Australians showed up, and you have to put this into perspective. Here's 600,000 people lived in the Philadelphia area. You were beating countries who could pull upon everybody with millions of people. We were beating those teams. It's hard to imagine one city could play competitively against anyone in the world.
Like the Chicago Bulls team beating all the countries, etc.
Occasionally in sports, you see one team just becomes incredibly dominant. We were playing at that incredibly dominant level on a worldwide basis in the sport of cricket. That's why all those teams came here. There were gentlemen of Philadelphia teams that went over every couple of years to England. Germantown and the other clubs often put a team together and they went and they played like the county level cricket teams, toured England. We played the Halifax Cup against the Canadians. God, we have a scorecard from 1853 when we were up in Canada, handwritten on this beautiful piece of paper.
I've heard that it's even older than the Ashes series in Australia and England. Is that right?
Yes, it was the first international cricket match played in the world.
We still play Halifax Cup.
I'm working with some people up there to see if we can possibly get something going along those lines. There's this big regrowth, regeneration of cricket, and there's just a huge amount of opportunities to go back because I think the Canadians would love to do it. I think we could do a lot more with the Australians and the English, and certainly India.
There's a whole period. I mean, you talked about the whole kind of history, and Philadelphia itself was the fantastic team. What happened? Why cricket declined? I think about a bunch of reasons, but love your take on what really happened in terms of the decline of cricket in the States.
It's important to understand that early on when the international teams came here, we didn't win all the matches. There were times when we didn't play very well. And that was part of a development process that took decades to become that competitive. When Pars 11 was here in 1859, they beat the Americans in less than a day. And they had scheduled to play 3 days. They actually just did a pickup match to fill in the time because their hotel reservations and train reservations were for a couple of days. It's like, let's play some more. Women of Philadelphia came out because they played in what is at the time was called Camac Woods, which is where Temple is now. The women of Philadelphia would ride their carriages out to the what was the Highlands where Temple is and cheered the men on playing. And they had a good time. They liked Philadelphia. They thought it was a wonderful place to visit. So there's no reason to leave. Over time, we got better. And what's important is when the ICC formed in 1909, the US got left out. There were tours that came over, but they weren't as high-powered teams coming, and they weren't here as often. And so the skill levels, I believe, degraded just because you weren't playing those same highly competitive matches to keep your skill level up. And then World War I happened, and a lot of young men died, to put it bluntly. We never really fully recovered. A lot of the British ended up in Hollywood, and there was Hollywood Cricket Club with Basil Rathbone and Sir Aubrey Smith and a bunch of guys. We have a bat signed by all of the members of the Hollywood Cricket Club, and they also donated all their scorebooks. It became more of a diversion. You played it on weekends, and it was a sport. If you played it, you wanted to keep playing it.
That kind of died out pretty much, right?
Yeah.
Coming to the present, cricket is now the number 2 sport in the world in terms of popularity and the number of people who are following it. The sport is completely evolved. Where is US heading in your opinion? There's Philly cricket going from your perspective. Because through an impressive time journey, people were different. The type of people who were playing were different. It's incredibly diverse. It's more accessible. Taking back for people in certain parts of the world, it is played like baseball. There's like 10, 15 games played in the same ground where I grew up in India. Whereas in the US, small leagues being played. So love your perspective. Where's US heading? Where's Philly heading in terms of cricket?
Let me take us back in time just a little bit to sort of put a stake in the ground. We're running the 35th Philadelphia International Cricket Festival next spring. I wasn't involved with the library then, but Craig Joss, Howard Chin, Melissa, Missy, Healy were involved in that. And what they realized is there was no communication between a lot of the clubs that were playing there. People were playing in Sarasota, people were playing in Denver, people were playing on the West Coast, but there was no communication between many of these. And if you held a festival, you could get people who were involved in the clubs together. You could build some community. You could run umpire training. You could do a lot of things to help the sport. A lot of which is just sort of know who can I call if I'm in Denver, who can I call to set up a match in California? I think that process stabilized a lot of the club level sport. I think it has significantly helped the local clubs here in Philadelphia because we run the festival at the three clubs and also Haverford College. But there's also been a tremendous influx of people who grew up playing cricket involved in the IT industry. There are two organizations in Texas that run leagues, and each one has roughly 100 club members. There's a lot of ground level activity among people who enjoy the sport, many of whom started playing it as children. It gives us a lot to work with. The big change recently has been both Major League Cricket and minor league cricket. I was extremely pleased that Major League Cricket, while they're hiring in people on a Premier League type of basis to work for the clubs, they have to live here. They aren't necessarily American citizens, but they're residents of the US in order to develop and make sure that they're not excluded, that they're getting that high level experience. There's 6 clubs now, and they're going to expand. That has huge significance in terms of the finance around the sport. There's a lot of trickle down that happens. It's going to start supporting the development of players. You saw the T20 championship.
That's happened in the US on the Caribbean in 2024. And they built a temporary stadium just for a couple of matches or 3 matches. And they had 35,000 people showing up just for those 3 matches.
And it's now going to be in the LA Olympics in 2028. We're getting a lot of exposure. The support within the community of people from the background is probably 15, maybe 20 million people who come from India, Australia, England, Canada, someplace where cricket is a mainstream sport who live here now. You've now got a critical fan mass where you can support the sport on a professional basis. And you also have people who are saying, I want my kids to have that same experience. It's like Haverford College is now beginning to recruit people, not because you want a great education, but you want to play cricket and get a great education at the same time. And that will help the college team be more competitive. We're at the point now where we have that kind of critical mass to grow the sport organically here. And then the real issue is how do you introduce the other 80% of Americans who live here to the sport? It's great that it's on Willow, but it's got to make ESPN, it's got to get on ABC. You don't have to spend a couple $100 a year to watch a sport you don't even know you want to watch. You got to introduce them on a mass basis, but that's coming. That will depend upon advertisers. But you have support of people like Microsoft. Nadella is one of the owners of the Seattle team. They have a cricket pitch on the Microsoft campus. You can play cricket during lunch if you want to, or after work. A lot of the pieces are falling into place for this to really be an established sport in the US.
Where can people learn about American cricket?
Well, if you live in the Philadelphia area, you're kind of blessed because admission to the cricket festival is free. So you can watch the festival.
Oh, there's a major league coming up this year, this summer. As you mentioned, it just started 2-3 years ago. That's a good one. The Philadelphia International Cricket Festival, it's going to be in May. Apart from people watching the game, following, if you could talk through where people can get access to the cricket library and your website, How can people contact you? And then you also have a book, very interesting for cricket fanatics like me. You could just talk through those resources. That'll be good as well.
Sure. The show notes will have our website, a photo website, which has history, has photos from about 20 of the festivals. You'll be able to click through and watch that. We'll get you the address for the festival organizers with the venues. We can get the address for Major League Cricket. U.S. Cricket Association has a website with a good deal of information for people who want to play. It's trying to foster people getting registered and being members and being players. It's really a player organization, and their goal is to develop high performance players, basically people living here who can play minor league and major league cricket. Very focused on that. They have a new president, new CEO who just came in, working just to straighten things out. The Willow website, if you want to subscribe to watch global, they broadcast major league. It's cricket almost 24 hours. Cricket's almost being played somewhere all the time. And they do a
Yeah.
pretty good job of broadcasting a lot of those events. It's reasonable for what you get. They do a really great job. We'd love to give people tours if they come by the library during the festival. We have an open house on Thursday night. You can come by. We have refreshments and we'll show you as much of the collection as we possibly can.
One of the things, Paul, the library for locals living in the area. So when I visited the library, I was smiling year to year, holding the bat of Donald Brad. Growing up, Donald Bradman was like big. It's still big for people. Holding that bat, someone took a picture and I sent it to my school group. Highly recommend folks to stop by Cricket Library. Incredible space, and it's right close to the cricket fields for Halifax.
We also have a bat that Dr. Grace used. We normally don't have people handle it because it's in need of restoration. It's old, but he scored 1,541 runs with it. He was very pleased to send it to us here in Philadelphia. And we have other kinds of memorabilia from Don Bradman. Freddie Truman was one of the guests of honor at the festival. He sent us a great deal of memorabilia later in his life. We have jerseys from the Australian test team. Ones have come up at various times. Gary Kirsten actually came 3 times to the festival.
Gary Kirsten, the South African cricket player and then former India coach, who currently is coaching, he came.
Yes.
Amazing.
First time he came, he was a young single guy. Second time he came, he had this very attractive girlfriend with him. And the third time, they were married and they had a child with him. And one of the things they really liked is they could be anonymous, just walking the street on the third trip. They went to Florida and had a nice vacation. Nobody bothered him because nobody knew who he was.
Yeah, if he walks in the streets of South Africa, India, England, those places, he'll be mobbed with autographs.
Dennis Lilly was one of the guests of honor. Same type of thing. He's used to being almost mistreated by people trying to show him deference. A lot of these people just want to be regular people. Go to New York City, be a tourist, see the world, and not be signing autographs every 2 or 3 minutes.
Paul, this has been phenomenal. Many of the history when we were chatting in the last few years, I even learned more in this conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with us and also kicking off the cricket podcast. Have a good night. Appreciate you so much.
My pleasure to be with you. It was very enjoyable.